Welcome back, Econ fans. We're now starting to get into the heart and soul of macroeconomics. In the previous set of lectures, we introduced GDP, how to measure GDP. We talked about the difference between nominal and real GDP. Then we investigated economic growth, the sources of economic growth, right? We talked about business cycles, unemployment and inflation that occur typically during business cycles, right? Then we looked at some Keynesian macroeconomic relationships. But now we're really going to get into the, like I said, the heart and soul of macroeconomics, and we're going to build our model of the macroeconomy using the tools of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Right? Aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's do aggregate. Let's speak about that one first. All right. Well, first of all, what is aggregate demand? What is aggregate demand? It's total spending by all buyers in the market. Right? Total spending in. The next slide will have a nice little definition of this as well, so we'll go over it. But you can think of aggregate demand as, okay, consumers. What do we buy? Durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, right? Gross business investment, right? So what do businesses buy? Businesses buy tools, equipment, right? Manufactured aids. They buy all kinds of, resources. So that's total spending by businesses, right? Investment spending. What else is part of aggregate demand? Well, government spending. Right, so we're talking about government spending on what we call social capital, things like roads and schools and national defense. Right, that's part of aggregate demand. And then finally, net exports is part of aggregate demand. So what we export to other countries. So it's total spending. It's spending in the aggregate. That's where we get the term aggregate. Right. So the downward sloping aggregate demand curve looks highly similar, if not the exact same as our good old friend the demand curve from way back when we studied supply and demand. Right? Except you're like, yeah, except as AD instead of D, right? Aggregate demand instead of demand. Well, beyond that, right? We know now that it's not measuring a single market, it's measuring the entire spending which takes place in the entire economy. Right? Now on the vertical axis, we're also measuring not just the price of one market or one single good or service, it's the price level or the general price level in the economy. Right? So the vertical axis is synonymous basically with the rate of inflation. Right? And we use the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, to measure or to report inflation. Right? So that's what's on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we're simultaneously measuring the amount of real domestic output, right, and how many people have jobs, the unemployment rate. So on the horizontal axis, we're simultaneously measuring there GDP and unemployment. Typically, as we produce more goods and services, we provide more jobs for people. All right, so here's our definition of aggregate demand, right, defined. So it's how much buyers collectively, right, how much output they want to, how much GDP they want to purchase collectively, right? And if I were you, if I'm taking notes, a good reason to do this would be simply to reinforce some of the concepts I just went over. Collectively, I would put down C plus I plus G plus X as collectively, buyers collectively. Consumer spending, investment spending by businesses on machines and equipment and tools, right? Government spending and net exports, right? So at each possible price level, so we just looked at this, we saw that the aggregate demand curve was downward sloping. It looks almost the exact same as a typical demand curve, right? So again, the lower the price level, the more aggregate demand, the more total spending in the economy. Right? If price levels go up, right, there's less aggregate demand, less total spending collectively. Right? So that gives us our aggregate demand, and that helps us graph our aggregate demand curve. Well, our aggregate demand curve, as we just saw, is downward sloping, but it's not downward sloping for the same reason that a single market demand curve is downward sloping. When we studied single markets, we talked about gross business, we talked about the income and substitution effect, right? So the income in the general economy, it varies with the level of output. So if we produce more, society has more income. So the income effect has no bearing on why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Likewise, since we're talking about total spending for everything, for all goods and services, by all buyers, for gross business investment, government, there's no substitute for everything. So we can throw the income and substitution effect out the window. they don't help us understand why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. But there are 3 reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and here they are. Right, the real balances effect. So imagine if I gave you $100,000, and that's the good news, and we'll just keep the date very simple. Right, so it doesn't matter where you are in eco land learning this, if it's spring, summer, winter, fall, nighttime, daytime, whatever. Imagine it's January 1st, and we'll just say it's January 1st of 2010. Now the good news is January 1st, 2010, I give you $100,000. The bad news is you can't spend a nickel of it until next year. Right, it has to be locked up in your room in a safe, and only I have the key or the combination, right? But a year from now, when you wake up, that safe will pop open. You can spend as much of the money as you like. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is when you talk about the real balance. In other words, what's that money going to be worth a year from now, right? Well, if we had a year of significant inflation, right? If price levels go up, the purchasing power, the real balance, the purchasing power, the amount of goods and services you can actually consume with that money goes down, right? And likewise, if price levels went down, if there was deflation during that time period, you'd actually be able to purchase more goods and services in the following year with that $100,000. All right, so that's the best explanation there we can give you for the real balances effect. Right, higher prices erode, higher price level erodes some of the purchasing power of money that's kept on the sidelines. Right? And if you think about it, in your typical checking account or even savings account, you don't get a bunch of interest, which probably doesn't make up for inflation all the time. All right, now the interest rate effect. Imagine if you were buying something for the last 10 years of your life and it cost $10. Right, every time you went to the store, $10, $10, $10, $10. Lo and behold, you walk into the next week and it cost $11. Well, you're now going to need more money to purchase that same item. Right? Now, we are not getting into the money market here. We will go into the money market in detail when we cover monetary policy. But in simplest terms here, that increases the demand for money, which pushes up interest rates. Right? Higher interest rates tend to curb the amount of gross business investment which takes place. Right? So if price levels go up or down, the increase or decrease in the demand for money tends to change interest rates in the economy and therefore alter how much spending takes place at the price level. The last one's simple. Foreign purchases effect. Foreign purchases effect. Well, if you live in France or Germany or Japan, or you live in China, right? You live in Brazil, you live in India, people in those countries can purchase goods and services produced domestically within their own borders, or they can purchase goods and services purchased anywhere in the globe. So if the prices of American produced goods and services go down, so in other words, if the general price level in the United States were to decrease, foreigners would buy more of our goods, more exports, more U.S. exports. And of course, if U.S. exports were more expensive, foreigners would simply purchase less. Right? Now, the next little thing there says graphically, but we already saw this graphically. So on the next slide, we're going to start talking about what would shift the curves. What would shift the curves? What would shift the aggregate demand curve? Either increase aggregate demand or decrease the aggregate demand curve. Well, just like we studied single markets, supply and demand, certain events will increase aggregate demand. Now, when you saw this curve increase from AD1 to AD2, you may have been very observant and said to yourself, whoa, what happened? Why was there a dotted line and then a complete shift of the curve? Right? Well, if you think back to our last section or series of lectures, we studied the multiplier in detail. The multiplier was the idea that if a business, we'll call this ABC business creatively, if they go ahead and spend $5 million on a new piece of equipment, right? Remember, that's called gross business investment. So when a business purchases a new piece of equipment, that type of spending is called investment spending, and that machine is now called capital. So if there's an increase in capital expenditures of $5 million, what's the cumulative effect on economic output? Right? Well, we said, well, typically that $5 million is the beginning, not the end of the story on how much it's going to impact GDP, right? So that's why here we have an initial shift of the curve from 81 out to the dotted line, and then the entire increase in aggregate demand caused by the multiplier effect, right? Well, you know, the multiplier effect can have an enormous impact on increasing aggregate demand, but as John Maynard Keynes pointed out, it can also have a significant downer effect on decreasing aggregate demand. It can cause aggregate demand to decrease quite substantially, to shift to the left quite substantially, right? So if that same corporation cut investment spending this year by $10 million, right, how much does that force down total GDP after the multiplier effect? Okay, so we just examined how the aggregate demand curve will either increase or decrease. And we examined how the aggregate demand curve, when it increases or decreases, it does so by a multiplied amount because of the multiplier effect, right? Some review of our study of some Keynesian contributions to macroeconomic thinking, right? So what will cause the aggregate demand to either increase or decrease? Well, we have to remember that the aggregate demand curve is total spending by all buyers. And by all buyers, we mean consumers, business spending, government spending, and net exports. So our good friends C plus I plus G plus X, you can think of the aggregate demand curve as being made up of the four components of GDP, right? So let's examine the consumer expenditures, right? The C component of GDP. Now remember, we spend money on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. So the question really is, what would make consumers, households, feel much better off or maybe much worse off about their financial well-being, their economic standing in life, and therefore either increase or decrease aggregate demand? Right? Well, the first of these four ideas is the consumer wealth effect. Right? So the wealth effect, and this is highly related to the performance of stock markets. So when the stock market tends to do very well, when the returns are very well over a period of time, people tend to spend money on goods and services which we refer to as discretionary spending. In other words, not necessarily your necessities, more so your luxury items, things that you don't necessarily need, but things that you desire, you want. So for instance, vacations, or refurbishing your home with nice new furniture, or maybe putting an addition on your home, that type of spending, right? So the period of 1994 through 1999 was 5 of the best years in stock market in really probably over the last 50 or 60 years. Just tremendous average returns in the markets. So if you were invested through a brokerage account, an individual account, or through your qualified retirement account at work, your 401k or 403b, right? Either way, you did really well, and you looked at your portfolio and you say, man, I feel really, really good about my position in life. So people tend to go out and spend some more money, right? Unfortunately, the stock market crashed in 2007, right? The S&P 500 was down something like 30-some percent. And so again, the same idea here in a negative fashion. This would cause a significant decrease in aggregate demand when markets tend to turmoil or to go downward. Right? That's bad for consumers. Right? The next one, household borrowing. Right? The house is typically the average citizen's most valuable asset. So homes are typically people's most valuable asset. Now it's a challenging time to say that. It's June of 2012 and we're going through a housing collapse. But let's talk about the good end of housing before we get into the bad end of housing and how that will shift aggregate demand. Right? So again, if we look at the period from about 1998 through 2006, a rapid increase in the value of homes across the country. So the average home price was going up, sometimes 50%, sometimes 100%, sometimes 200%. Right? It was a little bit crazy, right? A little bit ludicrous, but for better or for worse, it was occurring. So let's just use numbers as a practical example and show you how household indebtedness or household borrowing can be a driver of aggregate demand. Let's assume you bought a home in 1998 for $100,000. And of course, most people don't have $100,000 to put down on the house, so they get a mortgage. Let's assume you got a $80,000 mortgage, so you put down $20,000 as a down payment. And that's the way lending worked for a very long time in this country. You needed 20% down in order to buy a home, and a bank or a lending institution would let you borrow the other 80% in terms of a fixed rate mortgage, right? Well, what happens if between 1998, the time you buy your home, and 2003, the house is now being valued on the market at $200,000? That sounds a bit far-fetched, but it really wasn't. This was occurring all over the country in different markets where house prices were skyrocketing. So assume that the person paid their mortgage on time for those 5 years between 1998 and 2003, and now all of a sudden their house is worth $200,000. Well, they can refinance, right? In other words, they can borrow up to 80% of the value of their home. So if the house in that particular market is worth 200, right? They can borrow $160,000 against the value of their home. So therefore, right, they can take money out of the equity in their home and spend that money. I spend it on, they can spend it wisely on maybe investing in some government bonds or something that would be a guaranteed return. Maybe they put a down payment on another house and use the rental income to pay for their first mortgage, right? Or they could, they could spend it foolishly, go out and go on elaborate vacations and buy jewelry that they may necessarily not need. But either way, a significant increase in the price of houses tends to generate more aggregate demand for consumers. Plus, over that time period, interest rates fell significantly, so even people who simply refinanced their house but didn't take money out of their house, they still had more money in their pockets because their payment per month went down simply by refinancing their house to a lower rate. So that was all well and good and was a significant increased driver of aggregate demand that increased aggregate demand from, say, 1998 through 2006. But unfortunately, this whole house of cards came crumbling down, as we all know, and it ended quite ugly in 2007 when the housing market collapsed, and all these credit default swaps and derivative instruments, and the whole mess it became. So all of a sudden, people who got in at the end of the market were left holding the bag, so to speak. So imagine if you bought a house in 2005 or early 2006 for $200,000, right? And you borrowed $160,000, and now all of a sudden the house is only worth $140,000, right? So people tend to feel pretty badly about their financial position when they have a negative debt to equity ratio in their home, or their house is so-called underwater, right? They tend to cut back on all kinds of spending, and that tends to generate a significant decrease in aggregate demand, right? So household indebtedness is a huge driver of aggregate demand. Right? The last two are straightforward. Consumer expectations. The Michigan study every month puts out a consumer sentiment number, and they simply ask average Americans across the country, how do you feel about your job? How do you feel about your economic well-being? How do you feel about your financial position in the world? How do you think about 6 months from now, will you feel the same, better, worse? And they take a survey, right? And that survey comes out every month, and it's not the perfect barometer of consumer sentiment, but it's the best we can do, I guess. So that tells us how consumers feel about their economic position going forward. And this is a straightforward idea that the better we feel, the more money we tend to spend, and the worse off the average American feels, the less money they tend to spend, right? And then personal taxes. If we increase personal taxes, takes money out of people's pockets, that would decrease aggregate demand. And if we decrease taxes, right, that will increase aggregate demand. All right, so we just covered what would increase or decrease aggregate demand from the standpoint of consumer expenditures. What about gross business investment? Now, the great thing about covering this particular slide is we just went over this when we covered the investment demand curve in the previous set of lectures about macroeconomic relationships, the Keynesian model of the economy, and the multiplier. So basically it boils down to that relationship between the real rate of interest in the economy and then the expected rate of return on business investment. So what alters expected rate of return? Obviously, the four things listed here, right? Businesses definitely have a good barometer on what the future business conditions hold for their particular industry, right? Obviously, businesses have to keep abreast of new technological advancements that are available for the productive process, or the whatever methodology they're using for production, right? The degree of excess capacity, in other words, if a business is at or near capacity when it comes to the number of machines and equipment they're employing, and the demand for their particular product or services is quite high, then obviously they're going to need to expand when it comes to buying new machines and equipment, right? And then, of course, business taxes. Right? This one's a pretty straightforward idea. If you want more of anything, tax it less, and if you want less of anything, tax it more. C plus I, and our good friend G, government spending, right? So what will increase aggregate demand from the standpoint of the government? What will decrease aggregate demand? Well, any government spending tends to increase aggregate demand, right? Now, it's important to have a good ceteris paribus here. Ceteris paribus meaning other things being equal. Increases in government spending increase aggregate demand. That's assuming that interest rates and the level of taxes don't change, right? So, assuming all other variables are held equal, if the government increases spending on goods and services, on social welfare programs, on any type of government spending, is going to increase aggregate demand. So, for instance, you have a good example. If there's more transportation projects, right, that will increase aggregate demand, assuming that interest rates and tax rates have not changed. And of course, it's pretty much common sense. Any decrease in government spending will decrease aggregate demand, right? So if we cut back on military spending, that will damper aggregate demand. It'll shift aggregate demand to the left. This particular slide is important because moving forward, we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. In other words, what can the federal government do to help the economy along if we are either experiencing a recession or a significant amount of inflation? So increases and decreases in government spending, right, which alter the level of aggregate demand in the economy, are going to be significantly important going forward. All right, net exports. We covered C plus I plus G and X, net exports. All right. The first one here is national income abroad. This is an important economic lesson, right? It's one of those misconceptions by many Americans, especially when you see people wearing those silly things, or buy American, right? So national income abroad is very simple, right? If people living in Europe, if people living in India, people living in South America, if their economies perform well, they have more money to spend, right? What are they going to spend it on? Well, they're going to spend money domestically, and they're going to spend money internationally. So, Europeans, people living in India, people living in South America, right, if their economies in those countries are doing better, they will buy more U.S. exports. So it is not us against them. Right? That's not the way the economy works. It's not the United States against, right? So it's not an economic war, right? That's a misconception. We're actually made worse off when other countries don't perform well economically. So for instance, right now it's June of 2012. Europe is struggling with this sovereign debt crisis, right? Many European governments have national debts that are soaring, and there's this huge debate. Unfortunately, some of these countries are now declining or refusing to take austerity measures to cut back on social welfare programs that they can't afford. All right, so if Europe falters to a significant degree, that's going to be bad for the United States. We will definitely export less goods and less services to Europe if Europe falls back into a major recession. All right, so we got national income abroad, and then finally exchange rates, right? Exchange rates. The appreciation and depreciation of a dollar, right? The dollar appreciates. Well, the dollar trades every day. It's actually trading right now. It doesn't matter what time it is. Currencies trade, global currencies trade around the clock on exchanges. So, for instance, what is the dollar worth in terms of euros? What is the dollar worth in terms of yen? What is the dollar worth in terms of Brazilian real? Right, the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, right? You got the Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan, right? So you have all these currencies. Every day these currencies are traded on markets, right? So if the dollar is worth less today than it was yesterday against, say, the euro, we call that a depreciating dollar. The dollar has depreciated. It's worth less. It's depreciated. Well, that actually makes U.S. exports less expensive to people living in Europe. So a dollar that depreciates makes U.S. exports less expensive, right, to the country which we are talking about as far as comparing exchange rates. So for instance, if the dollar appreciates against the yen, it makes U.S. exports more expensive to Japanese people. Right? So changes in exchange rates will also impact aggregate demand.